The day my husband signed the divorce papers, he thought he was stepping into a new life. He had no idea he was stepping out of the only one he'd ever actually owned. My husband and I met in our late 20s at a fundraising gala for the Ottawa Heart Institute. He was charming in a way that felt effortless, the kind of man who made every room feel smaller just by being in it. I was working in communications for a Crown agency at the time, wearing a dress I'd borrowed from my sister, and pretending I belonged somewhere I wasn't sure I did. He laughed at the right moments and asked real questions and walked me to my cab at the end of the night, even though the cab was going in the opposite direction from where he was headed. We were married 3 years later in a small ceremony at my parents' property outside of Perth, Ontario, under the oak trees my father had planted before I was born. My father was not a flashy man. He'd spent 35 years in the construction and commercial property business in the Ottawa Valley, not developing glass towers or branded condos, but building the quieter, more dependable things, medical offices in Canada, small industrial units in Nepean, the kind of properties that stayed full through recessions because people always needed a dentist or a warehouse. He never called himself wealthy. He called himself careful. There's a difference, and he made sure I understood it. When I brought my husband home, my father shook his hand warmly and never once said a word against him. But I know now, looking back, that he watched. My father was always watching. He watched the way my husband spoke over people at dinner, and then immediately softened it with a joke. He watched the way my husband accepted compliments about his business acumen, without ever mentioning who had introduced him to his first investors, without ever saying that the seed capital for his first office development had come from a shareholder loan quietly arranged through my father's company. He watched and he said nothing, because that wasn't his way. His way was to build protections quietly, into documents, in language that most people skimmed once and filed away and never thought about again. My father passed away 6 years into our marriage, pancreatic cancer, 3 months from diagnosis to the end, which is not enough time for anyone to do anything except sit beside someone and hold their hand and understand that nothing is permanent. By the time we buried him in the small cemetery near the Perth property, my husband's business had grown considerably. A commercial real estate development company, operating out of a glass office in Centretown, Ottawa, with my father's initial shareholder loan tucked away in the company documents like a sleeping clause that no one had ever thought to revisit. I didn't think about it either for years. I had a son to raise, a husband to support, a household to manage. I had stepped back from my own career gradually, first to care for our son when he was small, then to manage the logistics of our life as my husband's business scaled, then out of a habit that had calcified into permanence. By the time our son left for university in Halifax, I was 41 years old and had not worked in my own name for over a decade. I told myself it was fine. I told myself we were building something together, even if only one of us was showing up to the office. What I didn't allow myself to name, not yet, was that I had been watching my husband disappear for at least a year before the evening I finally understood what I was seeing. The changes were the kind that are easy to rationalize when you love someone. New cologne he claimed a client had given him, a phone that had lived on the kitchen counter for 20 years and suddenly lived in his jacket pocket, dinner conversations that ended at questions I hadn't even finished asking, as if my voice was arriving from somewhere slightly too far away to be worth the effort of actually hearing. There was a woman. Of course there was a woman. I think part of me understood that long before I let myself see it clearly. Her name was Cleo. She worked in property marketing, the kind of polished, client-facing role that put her in rooms with developers and investors regularly. 32 years old, which I learned later, based in Ottawa, but with a lifestyle that required a considerably larger budget than her salary could support. I found out her name the same way women have always found out these things. Through a friend who'd heard things through a friend, through a social media account with a privacy setting that wasn't quite private enough, through the small accumulation of wrong details that add up to one very clear picture. The evening that ended my last piece of uncertainty was a Thursday in February. My husband told me he had a client dinner near the Rideau Center, running late, probably wouldn't be home until 10 or 11. I had no reason to disbelieve him except that I'd stopped believing him about small things weeks earlier. So I drove downtown and walked along Spark Street in the kind of cold that makes your eyes water before you've even had a reason to cry. I saw them through the window of a restaurant near the Byward Market. They were at a corner table with the low lighting that makes people feel hidden even when they aren't. My husband was laughing, genuinely laughing, the kind of laugh I hadn't seen directed at me in longer than I could accurately remember. She had her hand resting on his forearm, like she'd earned that right, and she was leaning toward him, and he was leaning back toward her, and the whole scene had the ease of something that had been going on long enough to stop feeling like a secret. I stood on the sidewalk for what might have been 30 seconds, or might have been 5 minutes. The February wind was pulling at my coat, and I couldn't feel my face, but I didn't move. I just watched, and then I walked back to my car, drove home through the empty streets, and made a decision. I would not scream, I would not accuse, I would not give him the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. My father had raised a careful woman, and a careful woman watches, and waits, and makes sure she understands exactly what she's standing on, before she decides which direction to step. The next morning, while my husband was in the shower, I called Rowena. Rowena had been my father's corporate lawyer for nearly 20 years. She was the kind of woman who wore reading glasses on a chain and kept her office at a temperature slightly too cold for comfort, as if she believed that warmth made people careless. She had drafted every significant document my father had ever signed, and she had been at his funeral. She was the closest thing to a cooper of his intentions that still existed. I told her what I'd seen. I told her I thought it had been going on for over a year. I told her I wasn't sure what I wanted to do yet, but that I needed to understand what I actually had, what was actually mine, before I made any decisions. Rowena listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me something I hadn't expected. Do you know what a unanimous shareholder agreement is? I told her I'd heard the term but had never read one closely. Your father did, she said, and he made sure your husband signed one when the shareholder loan was arranged. I think you should come in. I drove to her office in Westboro the following week. She had the original incorporation documents spread across her meeting table, along with the shareholder loan agreement and its attached schedules. Documents that dated back to the early years of our marriage, documents that my husband had signed in a conference room while celebrating being one step closer to his first major development deal. Rowena walked me through Schedule C. It was 12 pages of dense corporate language that most people would need a law degree to interpret comfortably, but Rowena had written it herself, on my father's instructions, and she knew every word. The relevant clause was on page 9. It stated that in the event of the legal dissolution of the marriage between the borrower, my husband, and the lender's daughter, me, the outstanding shareholder loan, which by then had accumulated to a substantial figure with interest never formally collected, would automatically convert into equity in the company. The resulting equity position, calculated at the original loan value under the provisions of the Ontario Business Corporations Act, would transfer entirely and irrevocably to me. What that meant, in plain language, was this. My husband had built his business on a foundation that belonged, on paper, to my father's estate and then to me. His name was on the operating agreements and the client contracts and the signage in the lobby. But the company's share structure, as written into a legal document he had signed without fully reading, gave me majority control the moment our marriage ended. Rowena pushed her reading glasses up her nose and said, with the measured calm of someone who had anticipated this conversation for years, "Your father never said it out loud to me. But I believe he knew that building something together doesn't always mean sharing it equally, and he wanted to make sure that if this day ever came, you wouldn't be standing in front of it empty-handed." I sat in that meeting room for a long time after she finished explaining. The light was gray through the tall windows, and Rowena had gone to get us both a coffee, and I just sat there, beginning to understand what my father had done over 20 years ago, with a quiet, calculated love that I had not fully recognized while he was alive. My husband served me with papers on an evening in late March. He set them on the kitchen island between us with a kind of deliberate gentleness that I recognized as rehearsed. He had practiced this. He had chosen the moment and the tone and the exact degree of regret in his voice, and none of it was truly for me. It was for him, so that he could leave feeling like the decent one. He said he thought we both knew this hadn't been working. He said he wanted to be fair. He said he hoped we could handle this like two adults who had shared a meaningful life and could honor it by ending it with dignity. He did not say her name, he didn't need to. I picked up the papers. I read through them without any particular rush, without any expression on my face, and then I looked at him and said, "All right, He blinked. I think he had been expecting more. Some part of him had prepared for tears, for bargaining, for the kind of scene that would let him feel like he was leaving despite resistance, rather than because of the absence of it. My stillness unsettled him in a way I hadn't planned but quietly appreciated. "All right," I said again, "if this is what you want." He signed his copies that evening. He looked, I noticed, like a man setting down a weight he'd stopped remembering he was carrying. He called her afterward. I didn't hear the call, but I knew he had. I could tell from the way he moved through the house in the hours that followed. Lighter somehow, already somewhere else, already building a version of a future that didn't include me. What he didn't know was that by then, the conversion clause in Schedule C was no longer a hypothetical. It was a mechanism, and his signature, the one he'd just put on our divorce papers, was the key that unlocked it. My lawyer filed the response within 2 weeks. We agreed to the divorce without contesting the terms. No prolonged arrangements. Our son was 22 and building his own life in Halifax. No dramatic legal battles. Just a clean, efficient process that my husband's attorney described to him, according to a mutual contact, as almost suspiciously smooth. Almost. That was the word he apparently used. My husband brushed it off. He was too occupied with apartment viewings and renovation quotes and the particular energy of a man who has convinced himself that starting over is the same as winning. The divorce was finalized on a gray Tuesday morning in early May. My husband left the courthouse and went directly to a wine bar near the glebe to celebrate. She had taken the morning off work. He ordered the kind of bottle that signals arrival, and she made a toast, to him, to them, to everything they were finally going to build together, now that nothing was standing in the way. I spent that evening in Rowena's office, not celebrating, but completing. She confirmed what we already knew from the documents. The moment the divorce decree was issued and registered, the shareholder loan had converted. I now held 63% of my husband's company, the company he had spent 17 years presenting to the world as proof of his own capability, his own vision, his own worth. 63%, built on a clause he had signed over without reading, in a conference room, in a year when he was so eager for the capital, that he hadn't stopped to wonder what my father might have thought to put in the attached schedule. I drove home to the house in Westboro afterward, and I sat in the kitchen alone, and didn't quite know what to feel. Sad, mostly. Not victorious. Sad for the marriage, for the years, for the version of my husband I had fallen in love with at that Ottawa Heart Institute gala, when we were both still young enough to believe that good intentions were the same as follow-through. 22 years don't disappear when a lawyer stamps a document. They just become a different kind of weight. One you learn to carry differently. But underneath the sadness there was something steady. Something I recognized as my father's voice, quiet and certain. Results speak. Applause fades. My husband did not discover what had happened for nearly 2 weeks. The first sign came when his business account flagged a restructuring notice from the company's administrative office. His assistant called him, confused. His signing authority on 3 of the company's primary accounts had been modified. He assumed it was a bank error. He called his account manager and was told, professionally and calmly, that the ownership structure of the company had changed, and that his authority was now limited to his minority stake. He called his business partner next. His business partner's voice had an unfamiliar edge. "I got a call from a corporate lawyer yesterday," he said. "I think you need to sit with your own lawyer today, not next week." My husband laughed. He thought everyone was overreacting. The letter arrived at his new apartment 3 days later. It was from Rowena's firm and it was very precise. It outlined the conversion clause, its legal basis under the unanimous shareholder agreement, dated 17 years prior, the relevant provisions of the Ontario Business Corporations Act under which the transfer had been executed, and the resulting change in ownership. It was 4 pages long. It was polite. It left absolutely nothing ambiguous. Cleo was home when he opened it. She read it over his shoulder, and he watched her face change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the particular way of someone who has been running calculations and just received information that breaks every formula she was working with. "What does shareholder loan conversion mean?" she asked. He tried to explain. The explanation didn't land the way he intended. She asked why he had never mentioned a shareholder loan. He said he hadn't thought it was relevant. She asked how his father-in-law, her phrasing, already past tense, had come to hold controlling interest in a company he had built himself. He said it was complicated. She said it sounded very simple. He said it wasn't. He called his lawyer that night. His lawyer confirmed everything in the letter. Then he said something that stayed with my husband long after the call ended. The clause was enforceable the moment you filed those papers. Garrison Marsh was a meticulous man. He built this into a document your client signed without review, and it has been sitting dormant through the entire length of your marriage, waiting for precisely this event. You didn't lose the company in the divorce. You lost it the day you chose to file. The weeks that followed were the loneliest of my husband's adult life, and the strange part was that he wasn't actually alone. Cleo was there, physically present, moving through the apartment, making coffee in the mornings. But something between them had shifted after the letter arrived. She stopped mentioning the second bedroom renovation she'd been planning. She stopped sending him property listings. She started taking calls privately, reconnecting with colleagues he hadn't heard her mention in months. He had told her a story about himself, a story in which he was the sole author of everything he had, the vision, the risk, the execution, the returns. He had never mentioned my father's loan. He had never mentioned that the company's foundational capital had come from anyone other than his own ambition. And she had chosen him partly because she believed that story. Not just because of the money itself, but because of what the money was supposed to represent. Self-made, certain, someone worth staking her own future on, even knowing the cost of that choice. Now the story had a different ending, and she was reassessing what she had actually signed up for. She had known he was married from the beginning. She had walked into that with her eyes open, and I have never pretended otherwise. But she had believed him when he said he'd built something real entirely on his own terms. And now she was discovering that the foundation had never been his to begin with. He had let her fall for a version of himself that was, in the most essential way, fictional. The conversation that ended things between them happened in their kitchen on a Wednesday evening in early June. She came home from a lunch she hadn't invited him to, and she sat across from him at the table and said, without cruelty but without softness either, "I need you to be honest with me, not about the money, about who you are when no one else is making up the difference." He had nothing to say to that. "I knew what I was getting into when I started this," she said. "That's something I've had to sit with, and I will keep sitting with it. But I believed you when you said you'd built something real on your own. And I'm finding out now that the ground beneath all of it belonged to someone else. I don't know who you actually are underneath everything that was never really yours. And I'm not sure you know either." She moved out the following week, efficiently, without drama, without any of the scenes he might have anticipated. Her parting words, said at the door with 2 suitcases already in the hallway, were the kind that settle into a person and stay. "You spent so long performing the version of yourself you wanted people to see that you forgot to build the actual one. I really do hope you figure it out." She didn't leave quietly in every sense. A week later she posted something on Instagram, a caption about learning to read the fine print before investing in someone else's vision. It was liked over 300 times by people who understood exactly what it was referring to. My husband's professional contacts in Ottawa's development and real estate community understood it too. Word moved through those circles the way it always does in a city that is simultaneously larger and smaller than it appears. Not through headlines or press releases, but through conversations at the Weston Bar after industry dinners, through the particular quality of silence that descends when a man walks into a room where people already know things about him he doesn't know they know. My husband's business partner reached out to me directly in late June. He had worked alongside my husband for 11 years, and he was, I believed, a fundamentally decent man who had found himself in a situation he hadn't chosen. We met for coffee at a cafe in Westboro on a gray Thursday morning, and he was honest with me in a way I appreciated. "I always sensed there was a structure underneath the business I didn't fully understand," he said. "Your father was a deliberate man. I think I knew, on some level, that some of what we built was resting on a foundation that wasn't entirely explained to me." He paused. "I'm glad it went to you." I told him I had no intention of dismantling anything. The company was profitable, well managed at the operational level, and had good people in it who had done nothing wrong. I wanted it run properly. I had no interest in burning it down out of anger at the man who had once run it. My husband came to the house in Westboro on a Saturday morning in late July. He sat in his car in the driveway for what must have been 5 full minutes before getting out, and I watched him from the kitchen window and felt something I hadn't expected, which was pity. Not contempt, not satisfaction, just the quiet, distant sorrow you feel for someone who has lost something they never properly understood they had. I let him in. 22 years of marriage doesn't evaporate in a morning, not even the end of 22 years. He sat at the kitchen table, where we had eaten 1,000 breakfasts, and he looked around the room, like a man revisiting a country he no longer held a passport for. He asked me to explain what had happened. He said none of his lawyers had been able to make sense of how he had ended up with nothing, after nearly 2 decades of building. I told him the truth, without embellishment and without cruelty. I told him about my father's shareholder loan, about Schedule C, about the conversion clause that had been sitting in a corporate document he had signed in a moment of eagerness and relief over 20 years ago. I told him that my father had never said it out loud, not my husband, not even to me until the end, because my father was not the kind of man who made threats. He was the kind of man who built protections into the architecture of things, quietly, because he understood that love and trust are not the same category, and that the people we love most deserve the kind of care that does not depend on everything staying perfect forever. None of this was a trap, I said. It was a safety net. You just didn't know it existed until you cut the rope that was holding it up. He sat with that for a long time. I didn't know, he said finally. His voice had lost the confidence I had known for so many years. I want you to understand that, whatever else I did, I genuinely didn't know about any of this. I believed him. That was in some ways the hardest part. He hadn't been scheming. He hadn't been calculating his exit for years. He had simply been so certain of his own story, so thoroughly invested in the idea that everything he had was the product of his own vision and his own courage, that he had never once thought to look closely at what was actually holding the ground beneath him. I know you didn't, I said. You never asked. In 22 years you never once asked. That's exactly the problem. He left that morning without the anger he'd arrived with. What replaced it was quieter and heavier. The particular grief of a man discovering that the signature he'd written with such confidence, the one he had believed was carrying him toward freedom, was the precise thing that had undone everything. He moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in the Glebe eventually, the kind of place he hadn't lived in since our early years together, when we were both still figuring things out and neither of us had much except time and the particular optimism of people who believe the future is something you build with your own hands. In a sense now it finally was. Our son flew home from Halifax in August. He took his father out for dinner one evening and took me out separately the following afternoon, and I loved him for navigating something unfair with more grace than most people twice his age could manage. Our relationship deepened in the year that followed in ways it hadn't had room to before. We started taking weekend trips out to the cottage on the Rideau Lakes that my father had owned, sitting on the dock in the evenings, watching the light shift across the water, not saying very much at all. Just being there together in the particular silence that only exists between people who have been through something real. Rowena came out to the cottage one afternoon in September. We sat on the dock with tea and she told me, with the directness I had always loved about her, that my father had spent a long time thinking about that clause before he asked her to draft it, that he hadn't done it out of distrust, exactly, but out of the particular love of a parent who has watched the world long enough to know that what we feel most certain about is often the thing most worth protecting against uncertainty. He loved you, she said, watching the light move across the lake. And he loved you the way his own father had loved him, by building something that would hold you up even when everything else gave way. I sat with that for a while without answering. I thought about my father in that conference room over 20 years ago, quietly arranging the architecture of a future he hoped I would never need. I thought about all the ways we protect the people we love in silence, in schedules, in provisions buried in documents that no one reads until the moment everything depends on them. I had spent 22 years in the background of a life I had helped to build. I had raised a son, managed a household, supported a career, and slowly, quietly, made myself smaller to make room for someone else's need to feel large. I didn't regret it, not entirely. I had loved my husband in a real way, for a long time, and that had been its own kind of life. But this sitting on my father's dock, overseeing a company I hadn't asked for but had apparently always owned, watching the Rideau Lakes go gold in the September light, this was mine. Not something handed to me, not something I'd been rescued into, something that had been mine all along, carefully arranged by a careful man, waiting in the fine print of a document no one had bothered to read, waiting for me to be ready to stand in it without apology. I thought of what Rowena had said at the end of that first meeting in her Westboro office, in the gray light, with the coffee going cold on the table between us. Your father built this, she had said, so that no matter what happened, you would never have to depend on someone else's promises to know what you were worth. I poured the rest of my tea into the water and watched the ripples move outward until they disappeared into something larger than themselves. And I did not feel triumphant, and I did not feel small. For the first time in longer than I could easily account for, I felt entirely, undeniably like myself.